Welcome, folks, to the 6th edition of Contrary to Popular Wrestling. I'm Carmine DeSpirito, along with my co-host, James Southard. Today, a very interesting topic. We'll be discussing Bruiser Brody, the man, the myth, the legend, right here on the podcast with some very, very interesting guests.
An interesting list of guests we have indeed. It is starting off with the Mad Dog himself, DC Drake, is joining us. He wrestled Brody all over the East Coast with NWF, the National Wrestling Federation. It's going to be great to talk to him and share his stories from knowing Brody inside the ring and out, and it's his first wrestling podcast appearance. Carmine, you got him to do it.
Well, we haven't spoken in 30 years, but you know what? Once a brother in the business, always a brother.
We've also got Herb Simmons joining us, the mayor of East Carondelet, Illinois, and the promoter of Southern Illinois Championship Wrestling. He was very influential in Brody's early years. He continued bringing him to St. Louis, and he even booked him out for other independent promoters. He was the first independent promoter that Brody worked for. It'll be great to hear some stories from him during Brody's prime of the 70s and the 80s. It's going to be a great time talking to Herb, another old friend of yours.
Oh, yeah, and I have so much respect for him. You know, he's the longest running independent wrestling promoter in history. In history, folks. Herb Simmons has been running wrestling shows in St. Louis for decades, for 40 years. And he has a contingent of wrestling fans that have been so loyal to him through the years, and that says a lot. Herb Simmons knows how to deliver as a promoter.
Without a doubt, you don't last as long as he does without providing great stuff, and he's going to provide great stuff to us right here on the podcast today. And then we're going to talk to noted wrestling photographer Scott Romer from Indianapolis about knowing Brody as a talent and as a subject of photographs he's taken. We'll also talk to him about some stories from his book. It's going to be a great time talking with your good friend, Scott Romer.
Oh, yeah. Scott Romer is a treat, and he's got some great stories to tell.
And then finally, we're going to cap things off with Bruiser Brody's wife, Barbara Goodish. She's going to join us and talk about what it was like being the wife of Bruiser Brody and what he was like as a family man. It's going to be a really great show. I think everybody's going to like it.
Well, before we do kick things off, I just want to make this clear right from the get-go. One thing we are not going to be talking about is his demise, the murder of Bruiser Brody. We are not going to be speaking about that at all. I find the whole thing to be just repulsive, disgusting. It turns my stomach. I think the topic is overdone. And why dwell upon the demise of a person? Let's speak about who he was, what he did when he was alive. I think that's the most important thing. I have seldomly heard anybody speak about Frank Goodish in that way. And today we're going to delve into who was Bruiser Brody? Who was Frank Goodish as a person, as a man?
And without further ado, DC Drake.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are so proud to have our next guest on. He's an old pal of mine. So honored to say that I had the opportunity to manage this next guest on a few occasions, and he was an opponent of Bruiser Brody many times. Welcome to Contrary to Popular Wrestling on his first wrestling podcast, DC Mad Dog Drake. Welcome to the podcast, Don.
Hey, well, thank you very much, Carmine. Let me tell you, I'm honored to have you been my manager for many matches. So it's been a long time, brother.
I loved bringing you to the ring on that dog collar and chain, and you would go one way, I would go the other, and then you'd be pulling me, foaming at the mouth with the Alka-Seltzer. Absolutely nothing like it. That crowd would absolutely go crazy before you even locked up with anybody.
And that was really the whole goal of the character I had, is really making sure the fans enjoyed their night. And that was something I worried about more than anything else. People went out there, they worked hard, they spent their money. I wanted to give them 100% all the time.
Your number one opponent, I'm going to have to say, is Larry Winters.
Oh, my God, one of the best. And losing Larry was such a shock. We had some great matches up and down the East Coast. Actually, we even went to Canada. We just had a great time.
I saw things in your matches that I never saw before. It was the first time I saw anybody come off a balcony.
Yeah, Philadelphia, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. I've never seen anything like that again. Well, until ECW. But, I mean, you guys are really, really trendsetters for the time.
Yeah, and we actually had some people come up to us and say, this might change the wrestling business. And that wasn't our goal. Again, the goal was working hard for Joel Goodhart, who was a promoter there. And again, giving people something different, something exciting. That was the goal.
I've seen you and Larry at the top of the bleachers, and then you take a shot and roll down the bleachers. Oh, my God. It was just incredible.
We did a show, Carmine. I don't really remember this or not. I think it was McGonigal Hall, but I'm not sure. Where we got up into the press box, almost
Right.
to the ceiling.
Yeah.
We were hanging out of the press box.
Oh, just incredible. What memories. Let's talk about Bruiser Brody, your memories of him. You wrestled him a lot with the NWF, National Wrestling Federation out of New Jersey. What are your memories of Frank?
Frank was a tough guy, legitimately, but also Frank had a side to him. And I thought about this. You know, today we have that term, social justice warrior.
Yes.
I think Frank was a justice warrior in wrestling going back 30 years. I think truly at heart, Frank really cared about what happened to the boys in the business. And a lot of people said Frank was contrary to work with. I remember when we first decided to bring him in, and I was working with Bob Raskin at the time, who was the promoter.
Yes.
And there was a lot of words that, listen, the guy's a troublemaker. He creates problems. I never found that with Frank. What I found with Frank, and again, with some very, intimate discussions with him, he worried about how the boys are being taken care of.
Is that right? So he was all for a union?
He never used the word, but he felt in talking with him that a lot of guys are being taken advantage of. And I remember one discussion that we had, he said that he often would talk to promoters or try to hear that side of things. And he said, but when it went to the guys and asked the guys to come and talk, he said they would back down. So he said at one point, I'm just in this for myself, and I guess that's the way I got to look at it.
Right. Was it primarily about paydays? Was it about work atmosphere? What was the talk mainly about?
I think it was about a lot of things. I think it was about paydays, guys not getting paid. I think it was about safety. Again, these were conversations I had with Frank. I remember one time, and I believe we were working at the Louisiana State Fair. We had just finished that show. The discussion was about wrongdoing in the business, and, you got to see that side of Frank. He was worried about his family, talked about investments. Who would think, look at Bruiser Brody, that he's talking about investments and 401ks and, what's going to happen after wrestling. He always had that one foot in reality.
Super intelligent guy. He really was. And a great family man. And he was somebody that many would fear to get in the ring with because he'd beat the crap out of you.
Oh, let me tell you, when he hit hard. That's wrestling. If you wronged him, he'd let you know that too. But again, you hear these stories about him. And I remember watching the one show where he got in there, I think it was Lex Luger, where he just sat in the ring and didn't move.
Right.
It was a cage match and Luger didn't know what to do. And that was Frank. Frank had his way of showing disapproval without always being physical.
Without taking the guy's head off.
Right. When I heard what happened to him, I know I don't want to go into that. But I thought about that too. And I said, in many ways, because Frank had that foot in reality, I don't think he saw something like that coming. He knew wrestling was what it was. And I didn't think he probably thought that someone would stoop to that street level of violence and that behavior. I think he felt he was safe in a way because he didn't look at the business as being that low that would happen to him.
And he also looked out for the boys. And with that in mind, he never severely hurt somebody, at least not on purpose.
Oh, no.
No, never.
I would say, and maybe the wrong analogy, but this is the analogy I would use, is like your mama giving you a spanking when you were bad as a kid. Frank would give you the spanking.
Right.
And that's the way a lot of guys learned. You learn sometimes by, getting your butt spanked, and Frank would spank your butt, believe me.
Spank you with a big boot to the head? Or
Oh, yeah. The big...
Oh, my God.
And let me tell you, the punch wasn't anything to be happy with either.
He definitely made you believe, without a doubt.
He did. I remember the one show where I ended up taking a boot. So we were in a steel cage match in Bricktown, New Jersey, I believe it was. And it was myself and Jamie and Kane against he and Jules Strongbow. And I forget what happened. I think I may have grabbed him by the hair a little bit too hard. And he let me know with a little boot. But you know what? That's the wrestling business. And after it was over with, it was over with.
That's it. There's no animosity or anything like that. Would you say that outside of the ring, he was the opposite of his wild man character?
Absolutely. I mean, he was well-spoken. Like you said before, super intelligent. Most of my conversations with Frank, I would say 95% of them was not about wrestling. It was about life. It was about what are you doing afterwards. It was about family. When he was outside that ring, he was a much different man. I thoroughly enjoyed what little time I did spend with him. That wasn't something that you get from a lot of the guys. You get in the car with these guys, you spend hours on the road, and you get these stories and, the bar room and this and that. When you reach a certain age, you don't want to hear that anymore. Frank never talked about about that. He talked about things that actually were meaningful and made sense, and it was a joy to talk to.
I only had the opportunity just to meet him a couple times, actually, at NWF shows. I was just a snot-nosed kid at the time, and I was definitely intimidated, but what helped me out a lot is that I went to my mentor, Dr. D, and said, Doc, can you introduce me to Frank? Because I knew that if I got the endorsement from David, everything would be fine. There's also some photos that I'm very proud of Dr. D and Brody staring each other down, which was my idea. I'm very proud of it, to bring two of the quote-unquote craziest guys, two of the most unpredictable guys in the business, and bring them together for some photos. Very, very proud of that. You know, while we have you, tell me about the NWF for a moment. The promotion lasted for a good 15 years, didn't it?
It was around for years. You know, it actually started, Carmine, out of a small promotion that I started in the Allentown area. Bob Raskin came in at the time, and Raskin was running his own thing too. He came in, and I had reached a point where I was tapped out financially. Bob came in, and he said, listen, here's some ideas I have. I said, absolutely. It's all yours. And the whole goal at the time, Carmine, was to take the local talent that we had and match them and work them with the name stars and try to build our own organization. Because we knew, honestly, that we didn't have the money to put these guys under contract. So anything we did on television, and again, our TV was all over the country in many places, we're Albany and all over the place. But we knew that without having guys under contract, other promoters could use our guys off of our show. So our goal was to build our own talent around that. And it was in business for a while. And we talked about what's the long-term goal. We wanted to have a ladies division, put a lot of focus on that. And as you know, in that New Jersey show, it was one of the first ladies steel cage matches that was ever ran. It was
That's right.
Heidi Lee Morgan against Wendy Richter. We were putting an emphasis on the women's division. We tried to put some hardcore matches in there, and we tried just to have what people expect to see out of wrestling. We tried to give a mix, and as well as, I hate that word, cinematic matches, but even back in those days, we were aiming towards different things that wouldn't expose the business, but still give it some excitement, something people didn't see.
Well, I remember going to the shows. You guys were doing stuff that nobody else did. The closest thing to it would probably be Florida at the time. Well, you guys were definitely the predecessors to ECW, without a doubt.
Again, our goal wasn't to always give that blood and gore, but we wanted to give people something different. We knew if we could get them to tune into our shows and watch this, that we could have a better chance of building up our local talent.
Shock and disbelief will definitely put eyeballs on the product.
Yeah, I mean, we did things like we had a wrestler named J.D. McSlade who ended up wrestling Abdul the Butcher on the show, and we had him carried off in a stretcher. In the back, we went back there with the cameras. We had two ambulance attendants back there taking his pulse. He was laying on the floor, brushed him away. We tried to show behind the scenes and keep it as believable and as exciting as possible.
Before that, very little of that was ever done on a wrestling show. You were a phenomenal booker. I just want to commend you for that. You were an incredible booker.
Well, thank you. The problem, as with all things, money. And
right.
You can only go so far without that. One thing that was really kind of sad, right at the end of the organization, we were close to a deal with a company out of Cherry Hill. I believe they were called M&M Syndicators. And they also syndicated, remember HR Puff and stuff?
Sure.
And they were going to syndicate our wrestling show with that. And that would have given us exposure in over 90% of the major markets in this country. For any number of reasons, things fell apart. And that was really the end of the business at that point.
Do you recall the last time that you saw Frank?
I believe it was at the Columbus State Fair. We did a show there. I believe it may have been June of '88. And this is a story about Frank. He and Abdullah were working. And they took their stuff outside. And when they got outside of the ring, they actually got into an area where there were a bunch of handicapped kids. And, the fair officials were steaming because of what was going on. People were trying to get the kids out of there. So afterwards, we went to Frank. We told Frank what happened. Frank went out there and took his time to sit with the kids, sit with the family. And this is something that a lot of people hear all the negative stuff about Frank sometimes. This was something that he didn't have to do, but he did it. And we were very appreciative of that.
Something that you taught me when I was just a young whippersnapper was, as a heel, make sure that you pay attention to those kids that are in the wheelchair, to the kids that are handicapped, to the special needs people, just in general, that are in the crowd, because they want the same interaction with you as everybody else.
Let me tell you what taught me a lesson about that. We were at the Garden State Art Center, and we did a show down there. That was with Damien. In the front row, that show was really for kids at summer camps, and the majority of those kids were special needs kids. So we get out into the audience, and, we weren't fighting out there, but you know how I used to chase people around?
Oh, yeah.
That was part of the dog gimmick. So I was chasing these kids around. They come running up behind me me and throw stuff at me. I'd chase him again, throw stuff at me, chase him again. And I probably spent 20 minutes doing that and 5 minutes in the ring. After it was over, we're sitting in the back, and a woman comes back crying. And the first thing I thought was, oh no, a kid got hurt. And she said that she was running one of the camps for the kids, and the kids were all terminal. She said this is the first time the kids felt like they were a regular kid. Even now, it chokes me up to think about that.
The magic of wrestling. You make impressions on people. You're not just an entertainer out there. You're giving people moments in their life that they'll never forget.
And think about it, Carmine. Think about the father who's bringing the kids. We did some shows, and I'm sure you remember shows of poorest areas, whether it be cities or rural areas or wherever you were at, where, there wasn't a lot of money. And for a family to come out and, get an autograph or get a picture or to spend time with them was so important, because that money was so hard for them to earn. And so they need to walk away from there feeling good. And that's right. Magic, wrestling is magic. At least it was.
Certainly. Leave them talking about something. Get the kids, when they go to school after the weekend, that they're talking about this wrestling show and they just can't believe what they just saw. But of course, that was a much more innocent time for everybody.
Yeah, it was. For me, when I was in probably a freshman in high school, my father ended up getting hurt really bad at work and was disabled. For me at the time, Bruno Sammartino was my hero. Although he didn't replace my father, obviously, he was still somebody who I looked up to, because he was genuine. You knew he actually lived the kind of life that you would be proud of outside the ring. Going to see him, actually, I would say probably kept me straight and narrow for a long time in terms of having that person to look up to.
I can say the same thing about you, Don. I sincerely can. You've always have displayed complete professionalism all the times that I've been around you. Even when, if I might screw something up during the match, you would take me to the side and sit me down and tell me what I did wrong, and that's how I learned. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for being on, Don, for being so gracious with your time, for coming on. You're definitely a pioneer in this business. I mean, you did a lot of things for the first time that nobody ever saw before. Thank you again for being on to talk about Brody. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. You made me think about a lot of good things today, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're a good man, and I respect you, and I look forward to having you back on. I'm sure that the listeners are going to be asking us to have you back on and to speak about your career. Thank you very much. Thank you, Don. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Carmine.
Up next, ladies and gentlemen, our next guest, a gentleman that has promoted St. Louis for, 3 decades, maybe even 4 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Herb Simmons to Contrary to Popular Wrestling.
Hello, Carmine.
Welcome.
Next February will be 48 years.
48 years promoting wrestling. Wow.
Yeah, can you believe that? I got to have a screw loose.
And you have all your hair.
Well, some of it still. I mean, it's getting a little thin, but appreciate the invite on your show. It's always good to talk to people who know a little bit about the true business.
Well, you were involved with Frank pretty early on in his career, weren't you?
Oh, yeah. Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody, King Kong Brody. When I say there's literally not a day goes by that I don't think about him, that's the honest truth. I have my 4-legged Belgian Malinois is named Brody because he meant so much to myself and Larry Matisek and fans of St. Louis wrestling. That's why we keep his legacy alive, the memories, and his wife, Barbara. I stay in touch with her on a weekly basis. She's such a lovely lady, and one of the promises that I've made her is that as long as I have breath left in me, Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody will always be remembered.
What Don Drake was referring to earlier was how intelligent Frank was.
Oh, yeah. The man used to always read the stock market, very intelligent when everybody else was sitting around looking at the wrestling magazines for the articles on themselves. Frank could be seen sitting in a corner, like I said, reading the business journals and the Wall Street journals, and had a great mind outside of wrestling.
What year would you say you first met him?
When I first got introduced to him was in the mid-'70s. Well, of course, I owe all of my headaches and career to Sam Muchnick and Larry Matisek. I'd heard all those horror stories about you don't want to deal with Bruiser Brody. He'll no-show you and he'll stiff you for the money. And Of course, when Larry first approached me about booking him, I expressed those concerns that I had heard from other people. And Larry, of course, had a great working relationship with Frank. And he said, no, he said, he'll be good. And that first show I booked him, his flight was late, which Larry didn't tell me. I was at the venue waiting for him, and you could hear the chant outside. And my wife come to the door, and she said, what are we going to do? 5 minutes before bell time. I said, what are we going to do? It's what you're going to do. You're going to have to go back in there and tell me you're here. But they come pulling up, and Frank got up out of that car, had his hair back in a ponytail, and then cut shorts on and his flip-flops, and said, big boy, I bet you thought I wasn't coming, didn't you? And, no, I never had to worry about it. And from then on, it was just a great friendship. Anything he ever told me, he delivered. And, of course, everything I promised him, I delivered.
If he respected you, it was quite easy to do business with him.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I remember an interview he did with a local radio station in St. Louis. He was promoting a show that we had coming up, and they was interviewing him over in St. Louis. And the reporter talked to him about the business and about how he did so much traveling and promoters that he worked with. And they asked him, he said, who's the best promoters you work with? And he said, I'm right here in St. Louis now with the greatest of all, and that's Sam Muchnick. And he said, there's this other guy over on the other side, that pond, Herb Simmons. He said, he's number 2. I always took that as a great compliment because, like I said, the minute he arrived at the venue, wherever we be at, his pay was there, and he always gave me the respect and said, what do you want tonight, big boy? And I'd say, what do I want? Send him home happy. He never let us down on that.
Who was the first opponent that you booked Frank against? Remember?
Yeah, I want to say one. I don't know if I can remember the first. One of the first was Bob Sweethand.
Oh, wow.
You remember Bob. I think everybody
Not
in the
a nice
dressing room,
guy.
guys that he worked against. Killer Tim Brooks, who we just lost not too long ago, was another one that we brought in. Professor Tanaka. I want to say, thinking back as I get older, my mind gets foggy. Dick Murdoch. A lot of these guys is who Frank introduced to me and said, hey, come on, I got a guy up in St. Louis that treats the boys right. And, that's what Sam always told me. You treat the boys right and they'll treat you right. And Frank, he'd make those phone calls for me, or somebody would call and tell Frank, say, hey, this guy Herb Simmons up in St. Louis is trying to book us, and we don't know nothing about him. And Frank would give me the thumbs up,
Now, not only booking Frank for your own promotion, but you booked Brody out for other promoters, didn't you?
Yeah. I had different ones that was, the independent guys in St. Louis also that knew what we were doing. I'd book him and Abby on different shows for him. And like I said, Killer Brooks was another one. I'd pair him up. And then, of course, I had a big guy working for me at the time. We billed him as the Giant Assassin. And then another guy, Nuko, the Russian. And they went on the road with Frank a couple different times, different bookings that I would set up for him. But, we had him down in southern Illinois, all the way over in the Indiana border when we were running against the Bruiser. Of course, one time him and Dick the Bruiser, had a falling out. That kind of just lit the fire underneath Frank, helping me promote mine. Because, one time when Spike Huber, when he divorced Dick's daughter, Larry and I was the only one that was booking Spike at that time. And, of course, we had Brody and Murdoch and Blackwell. And Spike joined that dressing room for us. But we'd run Spike and Frank along up at the Lamfair High School where Dick used to run. And that kind of made Dick get a little mad at me. But I just ended up buying all of his library, though. So he's gone, and his wife took care of me.
Speaking of Dick the Bruiser, our next guest on the podcast is going to be his former son-in-law, our pal, Scott Romer.
Oh, yeah. Scott's a great guy. If you haven't read his book yet, you got to read it.
Oh, it's a great one. I'm sure we're going to get into that. Let me ask you, the Brody-Abby matches, to me, that just epitomizes, both of them. I mean, if you ever want to show anybody who Brody and Abdul the Butcher were, just watch a match where they face off against each other. What are your memories of that matchup?
Always great. Biggest one I did with him was at the Dupo High School in 1987. Sellout, no seats on the floor because the school district had just redone the basketball court floor, and my wife was on the school board, and it took her to get the okay first to have a show there, but we had 2,200 fans crammed into the bleachers only on a Sunday afternoon, one of the few Sunday afternoon shows I ever done. At 4 o'clock, the main event was Bruiser Brody against Abdul the Butcher, and in fact, I got it on video. We put it on the 12 classic Wrestling to Chase volumes that's out there. Just a great match, typical get in there, do their thing, and then spill out of the ring, and they had the whole gym floor to go over and unload at the dressing room on them, and a few of the guys that's still with me, one of them, Gary Jackson, still wrestles for me. Got introduced to the concrete wall by Abdullah, turns into a little bloodbath every now and then.
A little bloodbath.
Yeah. Well, it all depends. You had to pick the spots. You're in the high school. They got a bunch of students there, so they took it easy. But that was the other side that people didn't know about Frank. He loved the young kids. The only show that was ever produced at the Fox Theater in St. Louis, we did, and Frank was there. And prior to the show that day, the Boy Scouts they brought in a bunch of them, and Frank actually gave them about an hour seminar before, and got out and got down in the seats with them and talked with them. And that was one of the plans that he always wanted to do, is kind of have like a boys' town that he was really planning on doing. In fact, Barbara could feed you a lot more information on that, because she was aware of those plans that Frank always wanted to do.
Yeah, Don Drake was referring to that as well. He cared about the fans. He cared about the wrestlers. He cared about kids.
As long as you kept him on your side, you were all right.
Having him as a friend, he would do business for you and be great to work with. Considering you were one of the first sort of independent promotions in the area, do you think the fact that you were opposing some of those established promoters, do you think that sort of earns some respect from him as well, besides the fact that you did take care of the boys?
Yeah, because we were the first independent promotion that he worked for. I'll never forget, we were running shows, and Larry Matisek used to come to a lot of them for me because he was helping me book a lot of it. And I remember the night had a bunch of the guys from the Memphis area, Tojo, Yamamoto, Gypsy Joe, Frank Morrell, Bill Ash, and George Winecroft. Those guys were all, I was booking them at that time. And I remember Larry standing there, and he said, "Hey, what would you think about bringing Brody in here?" And at that time, Brody was big on television and getting a lot of exposure. And I said, there ain't no way he's going to come here. Not for me. And he said, well, that was on a Thursday night. That Saturday afternoon, he calls me and says, "Hey, Frank's on board." So we booked him to the next show. And I asked him, I said, why is he wanting to do this? And he said, well, Frank, thing about business is he didn't want to be tied down to one promotion. He always said that you get out there and get your name made out there and work for the guys who's going to take care of you. And that's what he did. He would go in and try different promotions, but if they screwed over him, he would get his just dues, just like he did with Dick the Bruiser.
One of the things that fans don't know is that Brody was the original choice to be in Escape from New York that was filmed in St. Louis. Do you recall that time?
Part of it was filmed in St. Louis, and I don't remember what happened, why that didn't take place, but I do remember him talking about it. They say things happen for a reason, but Larry talked about it quite a bit too, because him and Larry had talked about going into business together also. I don't know if Drake had said anything about that, but the other plan that Frank had is he was going to be an agent. He had a lot of contacts with football players, sports figures, and he knew Larry had the ability to pull things together, and Frank had the connections with some of those, and he was going to go out and start being agents for some of those guys. They'd actually did a lot of work on that, trying to get everything in line, and it would have been something good to see. Could you imagine Frank negotiating for you?
He'd be great at it.
He'd be like you.
I'm so happy that you brought up Larry's name. What an asset to the business.
I'm going to tell you, I would not be doing this for 48 years if it hadn't been for those three people, Larry Matisek, Sam Muchnick, and Frank Goodish, because, like I said, more so Larry and Frank, they introduced me to so many of the greats in this business. Last week I interviewed Dory Funk again, who, has worked for me. A couple weeks before that, Terry Funk, Rip Rogers, Dr. Pritchard, guys that I met through them. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet him if it wouldn't have been for those three guys.
Herb, I want to thank you for coming on, for speaking about Frank. I know that he meant a lot to you. Thank you so much.
That's why we do the Bruiser Brody Memorial every year. Of course, it got postponed this year, like Barbara and I said, but it wasn't canceled. It was just postponed because we will definitely get caught up with it. But we do that every year, and we have a battle royal and award the trophy cup to the winner of the battle royal, and she comes in every year and presents it to the winner. And as long as I'm around, we're going to continue to do it. So I appreciate you guys paying a little tribute to him, because that's the way we're going to keep his name out there.
James, I don't know if you realize it, but there is not an independent wrestling promoter alive that has been running shows longer than Herb.
Oh, without a doubt. Southern Illinois Championship Wrestling has been the longest running independent wrestling promotion, not only in Illinois, but I would say anywhere in the world. And it's really great that you started up, you had the help of people like Brody, and you're still got it going, and you're still paying tribute to people like Brody. It's a great operation. I've loved everything I've seen coming out of there.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I tell them it's like baking a cake. You got to have the right ingredients. And of course, those ingredients are, you got to have a great locker room, which I have been so fortunate all these years. And still to this day, I've got Bob Orton Jr. that runs my ACE training academy for me. And of course, with his connection promotions, but then I got the greatest fans ever. And of course, you got to have a little bit of promotional skills, not myself, but my wife. But you put those ingredients all together, that's what makes it successful. Plus, you just got to be able to treat the boys right.
In my opinion, Herb, you are the template for what a wrestling promoter should be. Thank you so much for being on today.
Well, thank you guys. Well, we appreciate it. You guys keep up the good work. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next guest here on Contrary to Popular Wrestling, he is noted wrestling photographer, the author, along with John Cosper, of When It Was, My Life on Both Sides of the Camera, and son-in-law of Dick the Bruiser. Welcome to the podcast, Scott Romer.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be your guest on this wonderful brand new podcast that you guys created. I know it's going to be a big hit, and thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. James, Romer and I, we go way back and actually have a lot in common. We both broke in as wrestling photographers, then became managers.
Except you never had to set up the ring and tear it down for $20.
Come on,
I did.
I put it dirty my hands. Come on.
Oh, yeah?
These tender hands that I have, Scott?
Yes, they're very soft. You use palm olive.
Let's talk about Bruiser Brody, a man that you knew very well, inside and outside of the ring. What was the first time that you met Frank?
I met him at one of Bruiser's WWA shows back in 1977, and he was very cordial. He was very game on posing for pictures and doing basically whatever I needed to do to get him over in the magazines. At that time, I was working for Bill Apter's magazine, just basically shooting the World Wrestling Association wrestling shows, which was owned by Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder at the time. Eventually, I expanded my photography career and started working the St. Louis territory, which was owned by Harley Race, Bob Geigel, Pat O'Connor, and Bulldog Bob Brown. And they were bringing Brody in regularly. And he saw that I expanded my territories, and we always went out and had a beer after the shows. So he was really a good guy. Nice man. He liked me. Maybe part of the motivation was that I was working for Gong magazine at the time, and that was the major wrestling magazine in Japan. And wrestling in Japan is not like wrestling here. Wrestling in Japan is the number 2 sport next to baseball. One of their magazines, called Deluxe, was also a baseball magazine, so it featured pro wrestling and baseball.
Most of the photos of Frank in those Japanese magazines that were taken here in the United States, I mean, you took a lot of those. You witnessed a lot of great Brody matches.
Well, one of the big historic matches was Bruiser Brody against Ric Flair, which sold out the arena, also called the Chuckerdome in St. Louis in 1983.
What a match. What a match.
You can see that. They had 2 out of 3 falls. You can get that match on YouTube, I believe. I still get goosebumps when I watch. I'm able to see me in the background taking pictures, and that's one of my few loves that I like to do is photograph wrestling. So it shows how long I've been active in the wrestling business, which I was active as a photographer approximately 10 years earlier. So I was already an experienced wrestling photographer at a very young age.
James, have you seen the St. Louis match with Flair and Brody? It is off the chain. The crowd is just electric for that match. I mean, for the whole thing.
It's two guys that just know how to keep a crowd in the palm of their hand, and those two didn't work together often, so seeing them together, it's an unbelievable match that everybody needs to watch.
It definitely was a magical moment, and, you certainly don't see that style of wrestling anymore, and haven't seen it for 25, 30 years.
And you can see Brody have some brawls with Abby, of course, going all over the building, bleeding buckets, or conversely, you could also see a great wrestling match between Brody and Flair, or can't forget about Brody and Bockwinkel. Oh, Lord, what a great match. He could really get it done inside the ring.
That's right. I may have photographed one of those Brody and Bockwinkel matches. I'm not sure. I've done so many of them, and it's so long ago that I have such wonderful memories with Frank, and I've become very good friends with his wife, Barbara, and she's a regular at the Cauliflower Alley Club out in Vegas.
What a lovely lady, and we're going to have her on the podcast right after we wrap up with you. But first, there's an entertaining story that I've heard you tell about Frank and Dick the Bruiser.
Back in 1980. It may have been after that. I don't remember the exact date. But Brody was working for Bruiser, and Bruiser had shorted Bruiser Brody, who was wrestling in the WWA as King Kong Brody, as respect for Dick the Bruiser. They did a match. There's an old article in the wrestling magazines, Afters magazines, with my photos. I think it was entitled, "Who Has the Right to Be Called the Bruiser?" It was pictures of Brody and Dick the Bruiser. I don't remember how the story ended. Anyhow, Bruiser thought he was going to be cute and shorted Brody on his pay, and Brody didn't say anything. When he wrestled in Peoria, Illinois, Dick the Bruiser was on and promoted. Bruiser was finished with his match and was walking up the stairs to the dressing room when he was sucker punched by Bruiser Brody, and it caused a cut on the back of Bruiser's head. Now, you know, wrestlers normally don't gig on the back of their head, and I had seen Dick a few days later with stitches in the back of his head, but Brody retaliated by hitting Bruiser and knocked Bruiser down, and Bruiser said, "When I get up, I'm going to kill you." And Brody was still in his wrestling attire, grabbed his luggage, and one of the wrestlers, Dirty Dutch Savage, not the original one, drove Brody back to the airport. Afterwards, Bruiser used Brody on another show a little while later and had the money he had shorted Brody on in between his birdie finger and his first finger, held it out like he had a gun and gave Brody the money, like, "Hey, you do that again, I'll kill you." I think they reconciled, and there was no more heat, and everything was good.
You certainly did not want to short Bruiser Brody on his pay. That is one thing you definitely didn't want to do. Let's talk about Frank some more. Boy, you spent a lot of time with him.
I did. Gagne promoted a show at Market Square Arena in 1986 or 87. It was a very, very bad crowd for a building that housed 16,000 people and was the home of the Indiana Pacers as well. That building is now imploded. Brody and I went out that night, and we went around downtown and took pictures with Brody and the statues. Then we went up north, picked up my wife at the time, who was Dick the Bruiser's daughter. Now take it, she knew that Brody had beat up Dick the Bruiser by the sucker punch. Wasn't really a beat up, but sucker punched him. And there was really no heat, and we went out and had some drinks at a discotheque and had a good time. But as I was driving with Brody, he was telling me how he fucked Gagne over by not doing the 15 minutes that Gagne wanted him to do. He wrestled Jim Brunzell that night. They never made it to the ring. It was a brawl out in the stands. At the count of 20, it was a disqualification, and Brody was laughing as I was driving with him, telling me how he fucked Gagne over and the payday that he was going to have after the expenses. He's going to be lucky to make $75, and that he would have definitely rather have been home with his wife and his son. That was a fun time. I had wonderful pictures of Brody. They all appeared in the Japanese magazines. This is in the book as well. You just had Herb Simmons on. I had driven the day after I left my wife, Michelle, Bruiser's daughter. I drove to a show that was promoted by Herb Simmons, and it was the first annual Bruiser Brody Battle Royal. When I walked into the dressing room, the first person I saw was Dirty Dick Murdoch, and he comes up to me and he says, "You're Scott Romer, aren't you?" And he shakes my hand. "Yes, sir. How are you doing?" "No, I'm doing fine, but I'll tell you, it's all over the newspapers in Texas, where I'm from, that you beat the shit out of Bruiser's daughter, and the police are looking for you." During that time, I looked over, and there was Spike Huber, who was my wife's first husband, and he was there. And Michelle had actually called him up when I left. He just did that rib on me. But I thought, oh shit, now I'm a divorced man. I left Bruiser's daughter. This is going to cost me a fortune, and now the cops are after me. Oh my God, I'm a fugitive. But it was just a rib, and that's in my book as well.
It's a great read. I love it. You and John Cosper did a hell of a job with it. Some phenomenal photos. I mean, photos that people have never seen before. Also, a lot of photos of Brody in there as well.
There are a few of Brody, and then again, the stories that I'm telling you right now are also in the book, along with a lot of other stories, some stuff that people have never heard of before, but I was there. This business has been so wonderful to be a part of, and, you know, I'm so glad that I'm significant still in the business. You know, it's been nearly 50 years since I went to my first wrestling show. It's been over 50 years, and 50 years since I was taking pictures, you know, so I would say that I'm an experienced wrestling photographer for sure. I'm not real crazy about the way the industry has come about, but still I enjoy being a part of it. The greatest memories that I have are being at the Cauliflower Alley Club with you and Trevor and Jason Anderson. It's a wonderful organization, and I would suggest anybody that's a true wrestling fan and even a wrestler to get a membership and come to Vegas every April, because it's the best time you'll ever have, for sure.
Definitely. People can check that out, caulifloweralleyclub.org. You've documented so much wrestling history, and you've been around the business for so long. Your intentions in the business have always been pure, and you're very, very well respected. I'm honored to have you as a friend. I mean that, Scott.
And then I have real life, and that's we're completely opposite. So, I like being in the fantasy of wrestling more than the real life. My wrestling memories are the best memories I could ever think of, and it's really hard to top what you and I both went through back in the territorial days,
Well, we're very fortunate that we did, because those days will never come around again. The business has changed so much, and I'm very grateful for all the people that I met through all the years, all the legends that I had the chance to be around. And, that's one reason why we're doing this podcast, is because I realized, I know a lot of people in this business, and I could put together a heck of a podcast. And along with James, we've had a great run so far. This is our 6th episode. The wrestling business has been such an important part of my life, of your life, and I want to thank you for coming on and speak about Bruiser Brody, who was definitely an important part of wrestling history and iconic, revered in Japan as practically a god. And his legend needs to be told, not to emphasize on his demise, but rather who he was as a person.
You're one of the good people in the business, I appreciate the way you have preserved the history of professional wrestling. If there's anything I can do to help you guys, please feel free to call me anytime.
Scott, thank you very much for your time, my man. We'll be speaking to you soon. Thank you very much.
All right, my brother. Talk to you later, man. Bye-bye.
We now have the pleasure of being joined on Contrary to Popular Wrestling by the wife of Frank Bruiser Brody Goodish. Please welcome to Contrary to Popular Wrestling, Barbara Goodish. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, James. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, we really wanted to highlight the human side of Brody. So many folks see him as the larger-than-life personality in the ring, and we wanted to share the real Frank Goodish. We wanted to get to the man behind Bruiser Brody, and there's nobody better to talk to that than you. So, if you wouldn't mind, let's go back to the beginning. When did you first meet Frank, and what was that first meeting like? What were your first impressions of him?
Well, the first impressions, I was working in a hotel in Sydney, Australia, and it was a hotel where a lot of the boys would stay when they came overseas to Australia, when they did the New Zealand-Australia circuit. So I just happened to be working that night when he checked in, and that was the first of meeting him, of course. This was before computers, and so I would give the mail out to the boys and had any messages from their wives and family and that. So I knew them, and I was like a big sister. They were all like my brother. So it was a very interesting work. So I was kind of the first person he saw when he checked in. And when you have Andre the Giant, and when you have midgets, and when you have everything in between, everybody seems normal.
And that probably made it a lot easier to take to liking a 6.5 foot tall, crazy, bearded, wild-haired man like Bruiser Brody was. How was he when you first interacted with him? Was he friendly? Was he open? Was he an easy person to talk to?
As I said, everybody was very friendly because it was a strange country. You have to remember, this was 1977. It was a whole different lifestyle back then. And coming to a strange country, if you know, it's really quite different. So I was kind of the first person there that kind of reacted and were friends with these different people. So it was just a little bit different, if you understand what I mean. I had known him for probably 2-3 months just by giving mail, and when I was in the front desk or passing by in the hotel and that. Just one night, I filled in the front desk till 11. At 11 o'clock, all the boys were coming back from their wrestling match, and my boss at that time was an American gentleman, and he had a piano bar up the street. So I'm getting ready to leave work, and they were all pulling out of their taxis and that. And they said, well, why don't you just come up to the piano bar? Why don't you just have a drink with us? Well, you know what it was like when you worked late? 11 o'clock at night is like 5 o'clock for other people. So I ended up going. I just went up to the piano bar with them. There was like 12 people. You're talking about giants and midgets and everything. I mean, it was quite a show. And one by one, they all started to leave. Killer Carl Crott was a very good friend of mine, too. He was the one that had asked me up to the piano bar because he'd been there for quite some time in Australia. And so we're all sitting at the table together. One by one, they get up to leave. That's okay. You don't think anything of it. It's a bar. People are having, and one by one, and all of a sudden, I suddenly realized there's only three of us here. There's me, Frank, and Carl. Sure enough, Carl gets up to leave. Oh, I'll be back. I'll be right back. Of course, he didn't come back. I found out later I had been worked. He had told everybody, I want to get her by herself. So disappear. So he was still working right then. He worked me right at the very beginning. And then when I ended up coming over here, of course, everybody thought, he was over there for 9 months. Don't worry, he's just using you, being in a strange country. Well, sometimes he would have little problems with the promoter. So he came back on a Friday night and said, I'm leaving for America tomorrow. I expect it's nice to know you. Goodbye. Well, he'd been paid that night. The next thing, he put this bunch of cash on the table and he said, I would love you to come over to America. I went, no promises. There was no, this is going to happen or this is going to happen. And it was like knowing how tight he was with money and knowing that for him to put that money on the table, that he trusted me because I could have just kept the money and wouldn't have been any recourse. But he trusted me and I trusted him. And that is kind of how I ended up. And I figured out, I've been in Australia. This is a chance to see America. I had a round-trip ticket. And if it doesn't work out, I've actually taken a chance and seen America. Because if you don't take opportunities when they present themselves, you miss out on so much in life. And I had a round-trip ticket because you have to have a ticket out before you can go to any other country. What is it now? 78? I came here from 1978. 42 years. I'm still here, so I guess it kind of worked out.
Indeed, it did work out. And, of course, you would later go on to get married to Frank. And so what was he like as a husband? He was on the road a lot, of course, wrestling, but what was he like when he was home?
Well, you have to remember, he would have been gone. You add up all the different times that he was in and out of the house, because as you know, he worked a lot outside. We were in the hill country in San Antonio in a little place called Bernie. So I was at home and he would leave. I sometimes counted up and it was like 3 months every year that we would actually see each other. Not 3 months at one time, but as I said, just coming and going. And then when he started off in Japan, I mean, he was gone for 6 weeks at a time. Then he'd come back for a couple of days and then he'd go back on the road again. So it was a very hard life. And we were out in the country, so we didn't get to spend a lot of time together. But in life, you just work it out.
And he was most certainly dedicated to his family. We spoke to Herb Simmons earlier and Scott Romer, and they both talked about how much he loved spending time with his family, and he didn't get to do much of it, but he really cherished those times that he did have. What was he like when he was raising your children? Was he a good father when he was there? You know, of course he was working on the road trying to support the family, but what was he like as a family man?
Well, I think one of the funniest stories was when Jeff started school, and Jeff had a show and tell. Well, it just so happened that Frank happened to be home the day of the show and tell, so he took his dad as show and tell, and the teachers just loved it because here's this big 6'5", 300 pounds sitting on one of these little chairs. No wonder it didn't break.
That really would be a sight to see, and he was certainly not a small man and not a small character, but one thing that everybody says about him is he's definitely a very smart man, a reserved man but smart and always planning. He was always kind of looking towards the future, and I believe it was Herb Simmons told us that he was actually planning on starting some sort of like a boys ranch once he retired from wrestling. Were you privy to any of those conversations?
He was already thinking about what do you do after wrestling, because he knew that as a big man he could not stay wrestling with the amount of athleticism he did. He knew that there was a time that he would have to look for something else to do. So he did. He started a company called BAM, Brody Athletic Management. And what he was doing was trying to understand what it was going to be like after wrestling. So part of it was he had bought a plot of land. It was out, it had a little river going through it. He wanted to build a boys' club for the disadvantaged children. He could take them out there on the school holidays and show them how to fish, how to hunt, how to do things, and hopefully maybe change, because sometimes the youth just need somebody to take care. And he also was working with a college professor from the University of Texas in San Antonio. They were working on a skit. He had bought a wrestling ring from Blanchard, the one that ran the promotion in San Antonio. He had bought a wrestling ring from them, and they were going to do a skit with the professor from the university and go around to the schools. And this was when DARE, D-A-R-E, the drug program that they were putting in the schools, and he was going to do a skit in the ring about the dangers of drugs. And you think that they wouldn't have listened to Frank, who looked the way he did, instead of having somebody of authority going into the school? Let's face it, when you're young, you don't listen to adult figures, but to have somebody like Frank that would come do the skit in the wrestling ring, I think it would have absolutely been brilliant. But as we know, this didn't quite happen. But he had so many ideas of what he was going to do.
And that's something that a lot of people don't think about. What's beyond? And that seemed to be something he was always looking for, is what's beyond? What's family life like for him? How would you like him to be remembered? Of course, we as fans remember him as larger than life and all of the matches he had. If you got to speak as somebody who knew him personally, how would you want Frank to be remembered?
You know, I think he's already being remembered. A couple of little stories. One thing at the CAC, this young gentleman came up to me. This was a couple of years ago. Zuka King. He came up to me and he's telling me, I read your book, I watched Frank, and he went on knowing all about Frank. And I asked him how old he was. He was only 29 years old. He wasn't even born when Frank left us. Last year I was in Philadelphia and Charlotte, 2 different shows. Both at those shows in Philadelphia, a 21-year-old showed me a tattoo of Frank on his arm. He had Frank top and then it had both big tattoos on his arm. 21 years old, went to Charlotte. There was another gentleman there that had a big tattoo. I'm seeing there is someone putting his image on their body. You know, there's a lot of tattoo with Frank on it because there's a lot to put on. And telling me how they remember Frank. I can remember either seeing him in a plane or on the airport, that they were small, and if he saw that they were afraid, because he must have looked like some sort of monster to these little kids, and if he saw that they were afraid, he would come over and talk to them. They tell me that they write from its cover. So you say that, I think Frank has left such a lasting impression that even without anything, people remember him. And all the time I get messages on Facebook about memories of seeing him when they were young. And I think right now he has left a lasting impression. Not to get into it, this is 32 years and people still remember him. So unbelievable. I think they remember him as a worker. I think today's wrestling, these young youth, they're looking back on the old times, the old school wrestling. And I think a lot of them like the old school and wish that the old school was back, because now, not to get into it, but as you know, the new school is entirely different than what it used to be in the old days. I was lucky enough to go to an AEW. They came to town and Jim Ross gave me a front row ticket, which, thank you. And I went, I've never been in the front row. It was quite a thing, but they're very athletic. I mean, it's exciting, but it's athletic with everything that they do in the ring. But it's not old school wrestling. It's athletic. I mean, at sometimes I thought I was in a Circus du Soleil show. It was entertainment. Don't get me wrong. It was very entertaining, but so different.
And let's face it, 30 years from now, how many of those guys will be memorialized with tattoos and revered like Frank was? I doubt that these modern-day wrestlers are going to experience what it was like. Frank was an icon, revered all over the world as a great wrestler, and not only that, he touched so many lives and was such a great human being.
I know, and as I said, it's absolutely fascinating. fascinating. I was so happy, like everybody knows stories.
It's been an absolute pleasure getting to talk to you, and earlier you mentioned your book. We just want to go ahead and plug that. Brody, The Triumph and Tragedy of Wrestling's Rebel. You wrote that book alongside Larry Madisick. Where can people get that book?
I have copies, so they message me on Facebook. I try to get all my messages on Facebook. I can send them a copy, and I can personally sign it for them if they would like to get a copy. And if they have any stories about Frank, as I said, I love to hear the different stories. Well, he has his own Facebook page, too, if anybody is interested, and it has a lot of good videos, a lot of good pictures on him. It's just Bruiser Brody, Wrestling's Rebel.
What an honor having you on, Barbara. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak about Frank so candidly. I really do appreciate it. I can't say enough. You've always been so approachable and such a nice person. And thank you so much for your input today. It means a lot, and I'm sure it means a lot to all the listeners.
Well, thank you, Carmen, and thank you, James. When do you think we shall meet again?
Hopefully at the Cauliflower Alley next year.
I know. And I'll meet you at TGI Fridays.
I'll buy the first round.
You got it. I'll keep you to that, too.
Thank you very much, Barbara.
A huge thank you to Barbara Goodish for joining us, as well as our other guests, Scott Romer, Herb Simmons, DC Drake. It was great having them on, and it's great getting to talk about the life and times of the one and only Bruiser Brody.
Huss! 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 Boy, what an iconic figure he was. What an impression he made on wrestling fans. What an impression he made on young people that decided to venture into this business. I don't think there's been anybody quite like Bruiser Brody, and there never, ever will be again.
It was amazing getting to honor Brody's legacy, and of course, we want to remind you to check out all of our guests' stuff. We mentioned Barbara's book at the end there. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it through her Facebook and get it signed. You can get Scott Romer's book. It's a great book. The photos are incredible. His story is one of a kind. You can also keep up with Herb Simmons' Southern Illinois Championship Wrestling, SICW. It's great. They're doing good wrestling in the East Carondelet area. And then we also want to recommend you check out some Bruiser Brody matches this week. You know, if you've just seen him brawl with Abdullah, there's so much more to Bruiser Brody than that. We mentioned the Flair match with Scott Romer. You can see him with Bockwinkel and just so many great names. Do yourself a favor. Go on YouTube. Find some Bruiser Brody. Find something you haven't seen before. Watch it so you can truly understand just what an incredible performer he really was.
What a great podcast. Very, very proud to bring this to all of our listeners. You never know what we're going to pull out of the bag next. But thank you for following us here on Contrary to Popular Wrestling. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
You can join us on Facebook. Give us a like at Contrary to Popular Wrestling with Carmine DeSpirito and James Southard. That's where you'll find out which topics we're doing, who we've got coming up guest-wise. It's really the place to stay in touch with us. You can also send us an email at contrarypod@gmail.com, contrarypod@gmail.com. Send in questions, send in topic ideas. Just send us a message. Tell us you love the show. Tell us you hate the show. Tell us we made an error and you need to correct us. Reach out to us there at contrarypod@gmail.com. Carmine, any closing thoughts for this week?
It was an exciting one, that's for sure. Stay tuned, folks. You never know what we have up our sleeve for next week. And until then, we are out of here.